We continue now at the top of Daf Yud Zayin Amud Aleph in Meseches Nazir. This is Nazir Daf 17a. On the previous summit, there was a machlokus between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. Let's say somebody is in a cemetery and he takes upon himself a Nazirus. So Rabbi Yochanan says that immediately when he comes out, he becomes pure. He becomes a Nazir, meaning the declaration in the cemetery is effective, and it just waits until the person is able to be a Nazir when the person becomes pure. Reish Lakish disagrees and says that if the person is to become a Nazir, he actually has to repeat the declaration at the time that he is pure. He's not a Nazir automatically. The declaration he made in the cemetery is not going to be effective. And the Gemara now is in the middle of asking from a Tosefta. The Tosefta is talking about this exact case when a person says in a cemetery that he's to be a Nazir, and the Tosefta clearly implies that the Nazirus is Chal, like Rabbi Yochanan. So it's a question on Reish Lakish, and the Gemara answers, Hacha b'mayaskin, and Reish Lakish will say to you here in this Tosefta, what are we talking about? Biyotze v'nichnas. We're talking about where he leaves the cemetery and goes back into the cemetery, meaning there is an opportunity there when he leaves, where he declares the Nazirus a second time. Rashi over here says, "Hacha b'mayaskinon b'yotze v'nichnas sheyotza v'hiza b'shlishu v'shvi." He goes out, he sprinkles with the mechatos on the third day and the seventh day, v'tavel, and he immerses himself. V'hadar amar harini nazir, and he again declares, "I am a nazir." V'hadar nichnas, then he goes back in. Sofek es harboim, that's when he gets the malchus for becoming tamei as a nazir. Uliafuke midir Rabbi Eliezer. The point of the Tosefta is to go against the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer. The Yamar lo bo bayom mechula. Rabbi Eliezer is the one that said earlier that it's not sufficient for him to go on the very day of his purity to go and go back into the Beis HaKvaris. That's not going to be enough. In order to get the punishment for becoming tamei as a Nazir, he has to have at least 2 days, we said, of purity as a Nazir, and then he goes and becomes tamei. That's when we say that the halachas apply. So this Tosefta is against Rabbi Eliezer. You don't need those 2 days. Aval ilo hadar v'yamar. But again, the point is, according to Reish Lakish, if he doesn't go ahead and declare once again that he's a Nazir, eino aser legalech, then the prohibitions will not take effect. She'ein nazirus chala olav, because the Nazirus is not chal. That's how Reish Lakish will understand this Tosefta. And the Gemara continues, Esra, we have the following question, Ein bein tamei shenazar l'nazir tar. It says there's no difference between somebody who is tamei when he declares himself a Nazir and somebody who is a Nazir who was pure, shenitma, who then becomes tamei, except for the following distinction. Ela tamei shenazar, if you have a tamei person who declares himself a Nazir at the time of the tumah, so shvi shalo ola lo min aminyan. So that seventh day when he becomes pure, that actually immediately becomes part of the count of the Nazirus. However, the Nazir tar shenitma, but let's say you have a Nazir who was pure who becomes tamei, so now he has to start the count over again. So ein shvi shalo ola lo minyan. So that seventh day is not going to count because he still needs to bring a carbon because of the fact that as a Nazir he became tamei, so he has to wait till he brings the carbon, which is the next day, in order for his Nazirus to start. So the point over here is that there's a 1 day distinction in terms of when the Nazirus is chal. And so the Gemara now says, now if you think that the Nazirus is not chal at all when a person who is in a cemetery declares Nazirus, amai ola min aminyan. So why is it that the seventh day is part of the count of the Nazirus? Clearly, this seems to be like Rabbi Yochanan, that the Nazirus is chal. And Rashi explains, Tamei shenazir kegon sheyomin b'beis hakvaris v'nazir, again like our case. The person is in the cemetery, declares Nazirus, shvi shalo ola lo leminyan. So that seventh day when he's pure, it begins the count of the Nazirus. To kevon de taval v'habitar. The point is, once he immerses and he's pure, maschil limnos mibo bayom. The count begins that very day. Lefi she'eino maybe carbon, because he doesn't have to bring a carbon. However, v'nazir tarshin it's ve'in shvi shalo ola lo min aminyan. If you have a pure Nazir who becomes tamei and then has to restart the count, the seventh day does not count towards the Nazirus. Afal pisha taval v'utar, even though he immersed and he's pure, ad yom shmini, he's got to wait until the 8th day. Shemevi bo karbonosav, when he brings his karbonos. Kenaminu and perak gimel min and seder teglachas ketzad hayam mazu b'shlishi v'shvi u'megalayach b'shvi u'mevi karbonosav b'ches. Again, so the Bryce is making this distinction between the tamei person who became a Nazir and the tar person who was a Nazir and became tamei, and it's clear that the Nazirus is chal like Rabbi Yochanan, and so this is a question on Reish Lakish. And so the Gemara answers, Amar Mar Bar Ravashi says, Mechal kuli alma lo pligi dechailo. What you have to say is really, everybody agrees in terms of the Nazirus being chal. That was not the machlokas, Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish, not like we said on the previous summit. Everybody agrees if the person declares the Nazirus in the cemetery, it will be chal when the person becomes pure. Elaki pligi lemilki. The real machlokas between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish was in terms of whether the person receives malchus. Rabbi Yochanan savar keven the chayla laki. Rabbi Yochanan holds, since the Nazirus is chal, so the person gets malchus. Reish Lakish savar lo laki. Reish Lakish holds no, the person does not get malchus v'chayla, but still the nazirus is going to be chal. And Rashi says, Mechal de kol yamalo pligi de kaven de mashkachas tahara chayla memela. The moment the person is pure, the nazirus is certainly chal. Elaki pligi la milki. The machlokas is with regards to malchus. Rabbi Yochanan savar kaven de chayla lucky afilu atuma demei ikara the nazir beveis hakvaris. The chiddush over here is Rabbi Yochanan says the person will even get malchus on the original tumah when he declares himself a nazir in the beis hakvaris. He's going to get malchus on that tumah for being in the beis hakvaris at the time of the declaration. Reish Lakish savar afagav de chayla. Reish Lakish goes the other direction. Even though the nazirus is chal, shutarach lishmor mikol dikduke nazirus. The guy has to be careful from all the prohibitions of nazirus. Low lucky, he's not going to get malchus afilu atuma devasof, even tuma that comes later on, ilo hadar v'yamar, unless he goes ahead and redeclares his nazirus. And the Gemara continues according to Mar Bar Rav Ashi's explanation of the Machlokas Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish, Esrei Rabbi Yochanan the Reish Lakish. Rabbi Yochanan asked Reish Lakish the following question from the Mishnah: Misha Nazar v'hu beveis hakvaros afilu hayasham shloshim yom. If somebody declares a nazirus in the cemetery, even if he's there for 30 days, ein olin lo min aminyan, it doesn't count towards the number of days of the nazirus. Ve'eno mevi carbon tumah, and he doesn't bring a carbon tumah. And so the Gemara now infers carbon tumah hu delo maisi, so he doesn't bring a carbon tumah. Hamilki laki oleh, but he certainly does get malchus for being tameh. In other words, in terms of the halachas of malchus, the halachas are equal, whether he became a nazir in the beis hakvaros or not. And so therefore this is a question against Reish Lakish, who says there's no malchus. And the Gemara answers, Bedinu delisni eino loka. No, really it should have said there's no malchus. Elamishum de kaboy lemisna seifa. But since at the end of the Mishnah it wants to say as follows, Yatsa v'nichnas ololo min aminyan, there it talks about the fact that if he leaves the beis hakvaros and then he re-enters it, so then the count of the nazir starts. Umevi carbon tumah, and he brings a carbon tumah. So it talks about bringing a carbon tumah in the seifa where the person actually left the beis hakvaros and then goes back into the beis hakvaros after he's pure. Talks about the nazir starting after he's pure. So therefore, Tana Reisha Eino maybe carbon tumah. That's why in the Reisha it says he does not bring a carbon tumah. That's why it only discusses carbon tumah. But in reality, it could have discussed the malchus as well. It could be that there would be no malchus. And the Gemara continues, Tashma, coming here another proof, and this is from the Brisa we quoted above at the top of the Yomid. Ein bein tameh shenazir lenazir tar shenit, but there's no difference between someone who was a tameh person, meaning someone in the beis hakvaros who declared nazirus, and a pure nazir who became tameh. There's no difference. Ela shetameh shenazir shvit shelo ola lo min aminyan, except that if a person was tameh when he declared nazirus, so on the 7th day already he begins the nazirus, it counts towards the number of days of the nazirus because it begins when the person is pure. V'nazir tar shenitma, but if you have a pure nazir who becomes tameh, ein shvi shelo ola lo min aminyan, the 7th day does not count towards the number of days of nazirus because again he has to wait for the 8th day when he brings the karbanos. And so the point over here is halamalkas zev zeh shavin, but it does seem from this brisa that in terms of malchus there is no distinction between them. From malchus they're the same. The whole point of the brisa is the only distinction is this issue of when the count begins in terms of the days of the nazirus. And therefore this also is a question on Reish Lakish. And the Gemara says, Amar Lei, Reish Lakish will respond, Lo, no, letaglacha zev zeh shavin. What the brisa just means is that in terms of shaving, they're the same. Avalinian malchus, but when it comes to malchus, so then there actually is a difference. The Gemara says, but what are you going to say by malchus? Mai zeh loka v'zeh eno loka. Are you saying that by malchus there is a distinction that in one case the person gets malchus, in one case he doesn't get malchus? So listen, so that also should be in the brisa. If the brisa is giving distinctions between the tameh shenazar and the nazir tar shenitma, that is a distinction, whether there's malchus or not. And so the Gemara answers to that, betakante kamairi. What we're talking about over here is things that have to do with solutions for the nazir. In other words, we're talking about the day in which the nazir starts, etc. Those kind of distinctions. But bekilkule lo kamairi. We're not talking about distinctions that have to do with negatives, with punishments. So we're not making the distinctions, for example, in terms of malchus. And the Gemara continues, Tashma, coming here the following proof from a Tosefta, Mishaya Tameh v'Nazir, again our case, let's say a person was Tameh and he declared Nazirus, let's say in the cemetery, Asr legalech v'lishtos yayin, he's not allowed to shave, not allowed to drink wine, V'im gilach v'shasa yayin v'nitma l'mesim, now if he does shave, if he does drink wine, if he becomes Tameh Meis, Hareza Sofeg, so Arboim, he is going to get 40 lashes, and the Gemara says, Tiyufta, this is a refutation of the position of Reish Lakish, because it clearly says the person gets Malchus. And the Gemara continues, Boy Rava asks the following question, Nazir v'hu beveis hakvaros, if he declares his Nazirus while he's in the cemetery, Mahu, what's the halacha? Boy shehiyah lamalkus olo. Does he need to be there for a certain amount of time in the cemetery to receive the malchus or not? Rashi over here says, Boy Rava, Hoel Dam Rabbi Yochanan Deloka. The point over here is, since Rabbi Yochanan just said that in such a situation, when the person declares Nazirus in the cemetery, he does get malchus. Utanan b'masnisin gevase, we have a Mishnah like him as well. So the question is, Boy shehiyah lamalkus, delo lilki adelishi bei kedei shirish tachavoya. Maybe he shouldn't get malchus unless he is sitting there for the amount of time it takes to bow. Kedei mefarish b'shvut b'Meseches Shvuos b'Perek Yedias Hatuma. This shir is given in Meseches Shvuos. This is talking about in a situation where the person is in the Beis HaMikdash. So maybe over here also, so we'll say that there's a certain amount of time the person needs to be in the Beis HaKvaris. And the Gemara clarifies, Hey Chidami, what exactly is the case? If the case is that they tell the person when he's in the cemetery, don't declare Nazirus, so lama li shehiyah, why should he need to stay there for any amount of time, even the shortest amount of time? Still he should get malchus. Why? Because Nazir my time alo boy shehiyah, by a regular Nazir. Let's say a Nazir enters into the cemetery. Why does he not need to be there for any particular amount of time? To come Masribe, because they warn him ahead of time. They tell him, do not enter the Beis HaKvaris. The moment he enters, he gets malchus. So Hachanami come Masribe. Here also, they're warning him not to declare Nazirus. The moment he declares Nazirus, so there should be malchus. Rashi over here says, Nazir tor hanichnas beveis hakvaris. If you have a pure Nazir that enters the cemetery, my time alo boishia, why does he not need to be there for any particular amount of time? To come masturbate, because they warn him. Al tikonis leveis hakvaris, don't enter the cemetery. Hachanami masturbate, here also they're warning him. Lo tinzor, don't become a Nazir. Ushia lamali, why should there be any requirement for shehiyah for staying there for a certain amount of time? We'll continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Yud Zayin Amud Beis.